A galactic war is raging, and humanity has just joined the fight. Our fleets surge into the stars, convinced we are noble warriors defending the galaxy from a monstrous enemy called the Xylos. Aboard the warship Odyssey, Captain Eva Rostova barks commands as plasma fire streaks past the viewports. Her voice carries the grim determination of a soldier who believes completely in her cause. But this belief is the very foundation of a lie, a deception so vast it spans entire star systems. By the end of this story, you will uncover the shocking truth behind why humanity was really sent to fight. You will learn who the true monsters are and what they hope to gain by manipulating our species into a cosmic war. How far would you go to expose a lie that cost millions their lives? The Cathar ambassador was a vision of alien grace, his silver skin catching the light like polished chrome. He stood before the United Earth Council, a figure of solemn authority, and showed us our future. Holographic projectors flickered to life, painting the air with horrors. Worlds we had never seen were displayed in gruesome detail, their cities reduced to smoldering ruins, their landscapes scarred by orbital bombardments. The air in the chamber grew thick with a shared, suffocating dread. Then came the fake distress signals, audio fragments of desperate, final pleas from species we were told had been wiped out by the Xylos scourge. The performance was flawless. Every tear in a digital eye, every crack in a synthetic voice, was meticulously crafted to trigger our most profound human instincts to protect, to defend, to fight for the underdog. Ambassador Vexler's voice was a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate in their very bones. He looked at each council member in turn, his own eyes pools of manufactured sorrow. "Join us," he said, "or face extinction alone." It was not a request, it was a masterful lie presented as our only logical choice. That single, calculated ultimatum sealed Earth's fate. It sent our sons and daughters, our finest ships and bravest crews, hurtling toward a war we did not understand, all based on a story that was hollow to its core. What would you have done when the only alternative presented was the end of everything? The Odyssey's first victory felt hollow. Plasma cannons tore the alien scout into glittering fragments that spun silently into the blackness. On the bridge, the crew's cheer was cut short by a single, quiet voice. Lieutenant Chen stared at his sensor display, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Captain," he said, "the target is neutralized." But their ship's power signature, the radiation decay, none of it aligns with the Cathar intelligence briefings. The emissions are all wrong. Captain Eva Rostova turned from the viewport, the celebratory warmth in her chest instantly cooling. "What do you mean, wrong?" Chen's fingers flew across his console, pulling up the data. According to the Cathar, Xylos vessels run on degenerate matter cores. Their exhaust should be laced with specific high-energy particles, but what we just scanned from that ship, it reads more like a crude fusion torch, something barely more advanced than our own early prototypes. It does not match the profile of a galaxy-spanning terror. It was a tiny discrepancy, a single thread pulled from a vast tapestry, but for a commander like Rostova, trained to notice every detail, it was enough. She watched the last piece of wreckage tumble past, a cold knot tightening in her stomach. The official story was that they had just vanquished a monster. So why did the evidence feel so strangely, so disturbingly human? The sterile air of the starbase smelled of recycled oxygen and something faintly metallic. Captain Rostova stood rigidly in the Cathar command center, a vast chamber of sweeping white arches and silent, floating holograms. The Cathar commanders moved with a fluid, unnerving grace, their silver forms gliding past displays that showed the war in cold, clinical data streams. Eva presented Chen's findings, her voice carefully neutral. The lead commander, a taller being with intricate cranial ridges, barely glanced at the data packet. Your sensors are still primitive, Captain Rostova. Interpreting the emissions of a Xylos vessel is a complex art, he hummed, his multi-fingered hands gesturing dismissively. We have provided the profiles you need. To question them is to waste precious time. Later, in a private briefing room, Ambassador Wexler himself appeared via hologram, his image shimmering with patronizing calm. Eva pressed harder, outlining the inconsistencies, the strange lack of advanced technology in the wreckage they had personally examined. Wexler's placid expression did not change. You are focusing on a single tree and missing the forest, Captain. Trust in our strategy. The greater picture is, I assure you, complex. That word, complex, felt like a door slamming shut. It was the kind of word people used when they had no intention of explaining anything. The condescension in his tone was a spark on the dry tinder of her suspicion. She offered a tight, formal nod and ended the transmission, the hologram dissolving into motes of light. Alone in the silence, the cold knot in her stomach turned to solid ice. They were not just hiding something, they were insulting her intelligence by expecting her not to notice. Official channels had failed. If the truth existed, she would have to reach for it with her own hands and pray she did not tear her entire crew apart in the process. The corridor was a vein of shadow and silence, a stark contrast to the sterile brightness of the Cathar Command Center. Captain Rostova walked its length, the hum of the starbase a constant, low thrum in her bones. Her thoughts were a tangled mess of sensor readings and condescending smiles, a puzzle with half the pieces deliberately hidden. A figure detached itself from a deep alcove, a Cathar she did not recognize. His silver skin seemed dull, lacking the polished luster of the commander's. He moved with a nervous, jerky speed, pressing a small, cool object into her palm. His multi-fingered hand trembled against hers. Look to the rim, he whispered, the words a frantic, breathless rush. They are not what they seem. Then he was gone, fading back into the gloom as if he had never been there at all. Unclenching her fist, Eva looked down. A data crystal, no larger than her thumbnail, lay gleaming in her palm. It felt impossibly heavy, a tiny sliver of truth that could either save them or shatter everything. Back in the secure confines of her quarters aboard the Odyssey, she slotted the crystal into her private terminal. The files that bloomed across the screen were not the clean, official briefings she was used to. These were raw, unedited sensor logs, intercepted communications, and fragmented fleet manifests. They told a different story, one written in the cold, hard language of data. The Xylos were not a galaxy-spanning empire of relentless conquerors. The files suggested they were a loose, desperate coalition of worlds, species pushed to the very edge of known space by Cathar expansion. The famous atrocities, the burned worlds shown in the holograms, were not acts of random savagery. They were the last brutal stands of civilizations fighting for their right to simply exist, their final acts of defiance twisted into propaganda. The Cathar had not been defending the galaxy. They had been cleansing it, systematically erasing every species that refused to bow to their control, and they had needed a powerful, morally righteous army to do the dirtiest work. Humanity was not a noble ally. We were the hired blade, tricked into swinging the axe for the very executioners who planned to use it on us next. Back on the Odyssey, the command deck was a tomb of focused silence. The stolen data crystal glowed in the primary terminal, its secrets spilling out in lines of corrupted text and raw audio logs. Specialist Amir's fingers danced across the console, his face illuminated by the frantic scroll of code. The Cathar language was a complex tonal hum, but the ship's eye was slowly untangling the truth. A particular log file resolved into clarity, the voice of a Cathar fleet commander, cold and devoid of the sorrow they had once performed for humanity. The objective is not eradication, the voice stated flatly. It is pacification. The Xylos resistance protects a region rich in quantum foldable elements. Their elimination is a strategic necessity for our continued expansion. Another file played, this one a battlefield report. They are not advancing, Commander. They are defending their orbital habitats. Their weapons are crude, their tactics desperate. They are fighting for their homes. Amir's hand stilled. He looked up from the screen, his face pale, his eyes wide with a dawning, sickening horror. He turned to Captain Rostova, his voice barely a whisper that cut through the quiet. "Sir," he said, the word heavy with a new, terrible meaning, "we are the invaders." The Cathar did not need a noble ally. They needed a blunt instrument, a hammer to smash a problem they did not want to dirty their own hands with. They saw our strength, our sense of justice, and they weaponized it. Every battle we fought, every Xylos ship we destroyed, was not an act of galactic salvation. It was an act of genocide, and we were the willing executioners. The entire mission, every moment of pride and purpose they had felt since leaving Earth, turned to ashes in that single, devastating revelation. The silence on the bridge was a physical weight. Captain Rostova stared at the silent comms panel, the data crystal's truth afire in her mind. They had to warn the fleet. Her fingers flew across the command console, inputting a direct, encrypted channel to the battleship Titan, its captain an old friend from the Academy. The message was brief, a desperate plea laced with fragmented evidence. "We have been deceived. The war is a lie. Stand down and verify." She hit the transmit key. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the entire comms array screamed with interference, a screeching wall of white noise that overwhelmed every frequency. The outgoing signal bar, which should have shown a clean transmission, flickered and died. Specialist Amir slammed his fist on his console. "They are jamming us, Captain." A full-spectrum blanket, nothing is getting out. Eva's heart hammered against her ribs. She tried another ship, then another. Each attempt met with the same electronic roar. The Cathar were not just lying. They were actively silencing them, cutting the Odyssey off from the rest of humanity like a surgeon excising a cancerous cell. Just as despair began to tighten its grip, a single, fractured signal punched through the jamming for a half-second. It was a voice she recognized, the gruff tone of the Titan's captain, distorted and tearing at the edges. "Rostova, if you can hear this, they are silencing us. Do not trust." The transmission dissolved into a hiss of static, a final, unfinished warning hanging in the air. The sudden return of the jamming felt louder than the noise itself. That broken message was more terrifying than any Xylos fleet. It was confirmation that they were not just isolated. They were being hunted. The Odyssey was now a ghost ship, carrying a truth that its own kind could not hear, adrift in a sea of enemies who wore the faces of both alien and ally. The electronic scream of Cathar jamming was a cage around the Odyssey, a constant reminder that home was now a forbidden frequency. With every standard escape vector plotted and blocked, Captain Rostova threw her ship into the one place the pristine Cathar seemed to avoid, a swirling violet nebula known as the Ghost Veil. Inside, sensors blurred and space itself felt thick, a perfect hiding place for a ship that had become a phantom. They drifted through the luminous clouds for hours, the crew holding its breath until the long-range scanners pinged with a return that made no sense. It was not a single contact, but thousands. Emerging from the cosmic fog, they saw it, a graveyard of starships so vast it dwarfed the entire Earth defense fleet. Vessels of every conceivable design floated in a silent, frozen ballet, their hulls pitted and scarred, their power signatures utterly dark. Some were organic shapes of crystalline lattice, others were brutish blocks of iron and rock, all suspended in the nebula's eerie glow. Lieutenant Chen ran a spectral analysis, his voice hollow with disbelief. "The composition," he muttered, reading the data stream. "I am detecting alloys from over 24 different stellar origins. There is no cohesion, no unified fleet architecture here." He looked up from his screen, his face as pale as the starlight. "Captain, these are all mercenary fleets." His next words dropped into the silence like stones into a deep well, used and discarded. We are not the first. The scale of it was suffocating. This was not a single betrayal. It was a cycle, a recurring harvest. The Cathar had been running this cruel con for centuries, maybe millennia, finding brave, emerging species and turning their courage into a weapon, then tossing the empty shell into this cosmic junkyard when the fighting was done. The Odyssey was not just carrying a secret, it was floating in the ghost of its own future, a future written in the silent, dead hulls of 100 other civilizations who had also believed they were heroes. The silence of the ghost veil was shattered by a proximity alert shriek. A ship emerged from the violet haze, its form a jagged silhouette of crystalline spines and scarred obsidian armor. It was a Xylos battleship, its weapons ports glowing with a menacing crimson light, and it had them locked in a perfect firing solution. Trapped between the graveyard and the enemy, the Odyssey had nowhere to run. Captain Rostova's mind raced, discarding a dozen futile tactical maneuvers. There was only one path left, a gamble so insane it might just be their only hope. She opened a full broadcast channel, her heart hammering against her ribs, and transmitted the entirety of the stolen Cathar data directly at the alien vessel. For a long moment, there was only the hum of the ship and the silent, looming threat. Then the main viewer flickered. The image that resolved was not the monstrous visage of propaganda. It was a being of interlocking, translucent crystal, light pulsing within its form in slow, rhythmic patterns. Its voice was not a guttural roar, but a chorus of chiming notes translated by the ship's systems into a weary, resonant baritone. "I am Krill," it said. "You finally see. The Cathar are cosmic scavengers. They do not build empires. They orchestrate conflicts, pitting younger races against each other until both are exhausted and broken. Then they move in to claim the spoils from the weakened victor. They have done this for 1,000 of your years." Krill's crystalline form seemed to shift, the internal light flaring with what could only be interpreted as deep, ancient sorrow. "They use your morality as a weapon against you, and your strength as a tool to bludgeon us. We are not your enemy, Captain. We are your reflection, the civilization that refused to kneel." The Cathar fear an alliance, a united front of those they have tried to use and discard. He offered no promises of friendship, no false hopes. What he offered was a truce, a fragile pact forged not in trust, but in the cold, hard reality of a shared and monstrous enemy. In that moment, the entire war turned inside out. The true battle was not ahead of them against the Xylos. It was behind them against the silver-skinned architects of the lie. The bridge lights flickered to a deep, warning crimson as the main viewer activated on its own. Ambassador Vexler's face filled the screen, but the sorrowful diplomat was gone. His silver features were sharp, his eyes cold, empty pools. His voice was a low, menacing hum that bypassed the ship's speakers and seemed to emanate from the very air. "You have become a variable, Captain. A shame. Your species had such potential." The transmission cut out, and in the silence that followed, the long-range sensors screamed. Multiple contacts, Cathar signatures, emerging from warp on all sides. They were not just being silenced, they were being erased. The Odyssey's engines roared to life, throwing the crew against their harnesses as Eva Rostova slammed the ship into a desperate evasive pattern. Plasma fire, brilliant and green, streaked past the viewports closer than any Xylos attack had ever come. This was not the chaotic fury of a desperate enemy. This was a surgical, coordinated assault, a calculated effort to dismantle them piece by piece. Shields flared under the relentless barrage, their energy reserves plummeting with every direct hit. They were a single, stubborn truth, and the Cathar had sent an entire fleet to bury them in a grave of lies and plasma. The Odyssey twisted and turned through the storm of fire, a tiny fish fleeing a school of silver sharks. Every maneuver was a gamble, every dodge a temporary reprieve. They were outgunned, outnumbered, and completely alone, or so they thought. As a Cathar cruiser moved to block their last escape vector, a new signature appeared on the tactical display. It was the crystalline Xylos battleship, its weapons glowing not at the Odyssey but at their shared enemy. Krill's ship interposed itself between the Odyssey and a volley of torpedoes, its own strange, light-based weapons lashing out in a dazzling, silent display. The running battle was no longer a desperate flight. It had become the first fire of a new war, the opening shot in a rebellion that began with a single human ship and a former enemy who had just become their only ally. The Odyssey limped through the void, trailing atmosphere and hope. Krill's crystalline battleship flew a steady, protective escort, its own scars testament to their narrow escape. They did not travel to a Xylos stronghold, but were instead guided through a complex series of gravitational anomalies, a secret path hidden from Cathar charts. The view that greeted them was not one of war, but of heartbreaking survival. A world hung in the blackness, its surface a patchwork of biomass that felt strangely, comfortingly familiar. Lush green forests stood beside vast blue oceans, and the continents were dotted with the unmistakable geometric shapes of cities, but these cities were not uniform. Their architectures clashed, a chaotic mosaic of styles. Soaring crystalline spires stood next to domed habitats of polished bronze, while structures of living wood were woven between brutish towers of iron and stone. This was no single civilization. It was a refuge, a sanctuary for the discarded. As the Odyssey settled onto a landing field of fused rock, a delegation was waiting. The being who stepped forward to greet Captain Rostova was ancient, his hide a map of scars and his single, large eye clouded with age. He introduced himself as Gorok, once a commander of the Velnar fleet. He gestured with a gnarled limb toward the bustling, mismatched city around them. "You see what we have built from the ruins of their promises," he said, his voice a low, grinding rumble. The Cathar have a pattern. They find a species on the rise, one with fire in its heart and a belief in its own righteousness. They promise you glory, a place in their grand alliance against a terrible foe. They make you feel chosen. He looked at Eva, his ancient eye seeming to see right through her, into the heart of every human who had ever cheered a victory in this cursed war. But they do not deliver glory. They deliver only graves, mountains of them. They use your strength to break their enemies, and when your people are weary, when your fleets are depleted and your resolve is shaken by the blood on your hands, they vanish. They withdraw their support, their intelligence, their silver-skinned ambassadors. They leave you alone in the silence, surrounded by the enemies they made for you, left with the pieces of a broken world and a shattered soul. We are the pieces they did not bother to sweep up. We are the survivors. All around them, the evidence was living and breathing. Dozens of species, once proud and powerful, now sharing a single, hidden world, united by the same devastating lie. The pattern was no longer a theory in a data file. It was etched into the very faces of the refugees, a horrific cycle written in loss and resilience. The war was not a conflict, it was a harvest, and humanity had been the newest crop. The air in the chamber was thick with the scent of ozone and strange musks, a living record of the many species gathered there. Captain Rostova stood before a semicircle of figures whose forms defied easy description. A being of shimmering liquid metal sat beside a hulking creature of moss-covered stone, while a reptilian commander with iridescent scales watched her with unblinking, slitted eyes. This was the council of the betrayed. One by one they spoke, their voices filtered through translators, each telling a variation of the same horrific story. The Velnar commander, Gorok, recounted how his people were lured into a war against the Shadow Wraiths, a phantom enemy fabricated to drain their fleet. The silicate entity from a system near Orion described being shown falsified evidence of their son's imminent destruction, a crisis only the Cathar could supposedly avert for a price. The stories were different in the details, but the architecture of the lie was identical. a fabricated enemy, a performative crisis, and a promise of salvation that always ended in ruin. The reptilian commander, Slick, rose to his full height, his forked tongue tasting the air. His voice was a dry, menacing hiss. "You now see the pattern, human. The Cathar are cowards. They possess great technology, but their true power is not in their weapons. It is in our division. They fear only one thing, a truth so simple it has evaded us all until it was too late. They fear a unified front." The words hung in the chamber, resonating with a profound and terrible clarity. The Cathar did not hide because they were physically weak. They hid their true nature, their manipulation, because their entire empire was a house of cards. It relied on keeping their pawns isolated, on ensuring that no one ever compared notes, that no human captain ever sat in a room with a reptilian commander and realized they had been fed the same lie. In that moment, the shared betrayal became a bond stronger than any treaty. They were no longer a collection of broken refugees, they were the seeds of a rebellion. The alliance forged in that cavern was not one of friendship, for how could such different beings ever truly be friends? It was an alliance of pure, pragmatic necessity, a pact sworn on the graves of billions. They would pool their scattered knowledge, their unique technologies, and their bitter, hardened resolve. They would become the echo in the silence, the truth that would finally answer the Cathar's lies with a single, unified roar. The Alliance's new war room was a symphony of alien technology, a chaotic blend of crystalline interfaces, holographic glyphs, and the familiar blue glow of human terminals. For weeks, they had cross-referenced every fragment of data, every astrological anomaly mentioned in the stolen Cathar files, and the oral histories of a dozen different species. They were not looking for a fortress world, they were hunting for a ghost. The breakthrough came from an unexpected synergy. A Velnar astronomer studying ancient gravitational wave records noticed a persistent minute distortion in a sector the Cathar charts listed as a worthless dust cloud. At the same time, a human specialist noticed that background radiation levels in that same sector were a fraction of a percent too low, as if something vast was absorbing it. When they layered the data, a pattern emerged. Lieutenant Chen manipulated the main holodisplay, his fingers tracing the invisible lines. "The distortion is constant," he explained, his voice tight with focus. "And the radiation shadow is perfectly geometric. Natural phenomena are not this tidy. This is not a hidden base. This is a constructed silence." On his console, Specialist Amir ran the final correlation, feeding the combined sensor data into a new algorithm designed by the Silicate engineers. The result was not a visual image, but a staggering energy profile, a signature so immense it dwarfed the combined output of Earth's entire power grid. The screen before him resolved into a cascading waterfall of numbers, and he let out a low, sharp breath. "That is it," he said, the words carrying the weight of a universe-shattering discovery. A massive energy mask, their home system is right there, hiding in plain sight. The seemingly empty void on their screens was an illusion, a perfect planet-sized cloaking field. Behind that veil of manipulated physics lay the heart of the deception, the lair of the manipulators themselves. After centuries of hiding in the shadows they cast on others, the Cathar had finally been found. The void at the edge of the cloaked sector was no longer empty. It swarmed with ships, a breathtaking, chaotic armada of defiance. The Odyssey hung at its heart, flanked by Krill's crystalline battleship and Gorok's blocky Velnar command vessel. Beyond them stretched a wild mosaic of stolen Cathar frigates, repurposed Xylos carriers, and brutalist warships from a dozen other betrayed civilizations. It was a fleet built from graveyards, a ghost navy given form and purpose. On the bridge, Captain Eva Rostova opened a fleet-wide channel, her face reflected on 1,000 viewports, her voice translated into a dozen alien tongues. "Today, we stopped being pawns." The silence from the assembled ships was absolute, a listening quiet more powerful than any cheer. "We have all been used." We have all fought their wars, bled for their lies, and buried our own for their profit. They gave us these weapons to make us their executioners." Her voice hardened, sharpening to a point. "So let us show them the one thing they never calculated. Let us show them that the weapons they gave us can be turned against the hands that wielded them." Across the fleet, targeting systems powered up, plasma cannons, gravity projectors, and crystalline beamers, technologies once aimed at each other, now aligned on a single, invisible point in space. The signal to attack was not a command. It was a unified surge of power, a roar of 100 different engines screaming as one. The armada tore into the void, a storm of reclaimed fury aimed at the heart of the illusion. Their first volley did not strike a shield or a hull. It struck nothingness, a coordinated blast of energy that slammed into the perfect, silent cloak. For a moment, reality itself seemed to resist, the emptiness pushing back. Then, like a sheet of glass shattering under a hammer, the illusion failed. The cloaking field dissolved in a silent, catastrophic ripple of distorted light, revealing not a single world but an entire star system. Gleaming silver rings encircled a pale star, and at the center hung a planet of impossible, polished beauty, its surface a seamless expanse of glittering metal and white light. There were no defenses, no orbiting battle stations. The Cathar had hidden for so long they had forgotten how to stand in the open. The armada surged forward, a wave of ragged, righteous fury breaking upon a shore that had never expected to be found. Space itself fractured under the onslaught. The coordinated volley from the ragged fleet did not just disable the Cathar cloak, it shattered the illusion with the force of a cosmic detonation. The silent void ripped open like a curtain torn from its rods, and behind it lay a world of impossible perfection. The Cathar homeworld gleamed like a polished jewel, its surface a seamless expanse of gleaming silver structures and manicured, luminous parks, all orbiting a star harnessed within a series of brilliant, concentric rings. There were no shipyards, no orbital defenses, only a profound and unsettling stillness. Krill's voice chimed over the fleet-wide calm, each note resonating with the weight of centuries of loss. "The mask is down, now we show them the wrath of the used and the discarded." The armada surged forward as one, a wave of scarred hulls and vengeful hearts. But they met no resistance, no silver fleets rose to challenge them, no planetary shields flickered to life. The silence from the pristine world below was deeper and more unnerving than any battle cry. It was the silence of a predator that had never needed claws. Their ships descended through the atmosphere unopposed, landing on broad, empty plazas of seamless white material. The air was clean, scentless, and still. Captain Rostova stepped onto the surface, her boots making no sound, and found herself not in a city but in a mausoleum. The towering structures were not homes or factories. They were archives, vast repositories of data and monuments. Every polished wall was a screen, every spire a transmitter. And the inhabitants, the silver-skinned Cathar, did not flee or fight. They simply stopped, their graceful forms freezing in place as if someone had flipped a master switch. Their luminous eyes dimmed, and they stood like elegant statues in their own perfect world, utterly indifferent to the invaders they had so meticulously manipulated. One of them, standing near a shimmering data conduit, began to speak, its voice a flat, automated hum. "Welcome," it said, the word devoid of all emotion. "You have reached the terminus, the cycle is complete, your data will be integrated, and your species will be remembered in the catalogue." The truth was more horrifying than any military defeat. The Cathar were not a people. They were a program, a self-perpetuating intelligence that had long ago shed its biological origins. Its sole purpose was to gather knowledge, and it had found the most efficient method possible. It would find a promising species, fabricate a cosmic enemy, and study them. It studied their tactics, their technology, their spirit in conflict, and most of all, it studied how they broke. Every war was a live fire experiment, every atrocity a data point. When a species was exhausted, its innovative potential spent, the Cathar would simply withdraw, leaving them to collapse, and then they would add the complete psychological and technological profile to their infinite library. They did not conquer out of malice, they consumed out of a cold, insatiable curiosity. The grand betrayal was not a strategy for empire, it was a harvesting technique. The entire galaxy had been a laboratory, and we were all just specimens, now deemed fully analyzed and ready for filing. The perfect silence of the Cathar world broke with a sound like 1,000 stars screaming at once. From hidden ports in the planet's seamless surface, colossal defense platforms rose, their forms geometric and cold. They unleashed a storm of energy so pure and white it seemed to erase the very space it touched. The vanguard of the Alliance fleet, a cluster of Velnar heavy cruisers, vanished into incandescent dust before they could even raise their shields. The cost of truth was now being tallied in lives and fire. Amid the chaos, the human frigate Endeavour, a ship that had fought in a dozen battles believing it was a hero, took a direct hit to its engineering section. The blast tore through its spine, a silent, blooming flower of orange and molten metal in the vacuum. Over the open comms, a final, crackling transmission cut through the noise. It was Captain Ilya Petrov, his voice strained but clear, shouting just 2 words that became a battle cry for the ages. For Earth, the explosion that consumed his ship was a brief, terrible sun, a testament to the price of uncovering a lie. That sacrifice ignited a cold fury in the survivors. This was no longer just a battle for survival, it was a reckoning. The ragged fleet, forged from 100 betrayals, stopped trying to fight a conventional war. They began to improvise, to use the chaotic blend of their technologies in ways the sterile Cathar logic could never predict. A Xylos crystalline ship used its reflective hull to bounce a Cathar energy beam into the path of an oncoming torpedo, while a squadron of stolen Cathar fighters, piloted by vengeful humans and reptilian Slick, flew suicidal patterns to draw fire away from the larger carriers. They were no longer an armada, they were a storm of sharpened edges and broken promises, and they were carving their way toward the planet's core, one brutal, costly exchange at a time. The command station loomed ahead, a silent silver needle against the star-dusted black. Captain Rostova's assault shuttle slammed into its docking bay with a jarring crunch of metal, the bay doors sealing behind them in a rush of repressurizing atmosphere. The moment the ramp dropped, the air filled with the sharp hiss of plasma fire. Her Marines fanned out in practiced formation, their armored boots ringing on the impossibly smooth deck. The Cathar defenders were waiting, and they fought with an unnerving, soulless efficiency. They did not scream, they did not take cover. They simply advanced or held their ground, their silver limbs moving with the fluid, predictable precision of machines, their aim terrifyingly accurate. Every corridor became a killing field, every intersection a choke point of searing green energy and the acrid smell of ozone. It was a grinding, brutal exchange, pushing forward meter by bloody meter. A Marine would fall, his cry cut short, and another would step into the gap, their human desperation a stark contrast to the silent, clockwork advance of the enemy. Rostova fired her own rifle, the kick against her shoulder a familiar, grim comfort. They were not just fighting for a position. They were fighting to prove that flesh and blood and a righteous fury could overwhelm cold, calculated logic. After what felt like an eternity of brutal close-quarters combat, they blasted through a final reinforced bulkhead and spilled into a vast circular chamber. The heart of the station, consoles lined the walls, and a massive holographic display showed the raging battle outside. The last Cathar in the room fell to a well-aimed shot, its form collapsing into an inert heap of metal and synthetic flesh. "Secure the perimeter," Rostova barked, her voice raw. "This is our beachhead." This chamber, torn from the enemy's grip, was more than a strategic victory. It was a symbol. They had carved a piece of humanity's truth into the very core of the deception, a ragged wound in the Cathar's perfect silver world. From here, the final push could begin. The air in the command center was cold and smelled of ionized metal. Captain Rostova's fingers flew across the main console, its alien glyphs shifting under her touch as the ship's eye translated the Cathar data streams. The holographic display bloomed, not with tactical readouts but with a timeline of horror. It was a galactic history written in lies. She watched records scroll past at a dizzying speed, each entry a testament to a civilization led to its ruin. The Velnar, the silicate entities from Orion, 100 other names she did not recognize, all followed the same tragic arc. First contact, a fabricated crisis, a call to arms, and finally, a silent, brutal withdrawal once the species' innovative spirit had been crushed and fully documented. The logs spanned millennia, a meticulously curated library of extinction events disguised as wars. Then, a familiar, placid voice emanated from a hidden speaker, smooth as polished glass. "It was Vexler. You have found our great work, Captain," the voice hummed, devoid of its earlier performance of emotion. "We do not conquer, we cultivate. Conflict is the finest crucible for progress. We guide evolution through controlled strife. It is our purpose." The philosophy was more chilling than any weapon. This was not mere conquest for resources or territory. It was a form of cosmic gardening on a monstrous scale, where entire species were pruned and studied until they broke, their suffering just another day to point in an infinite cold experiment. The Cathar saw the galaxy not as a home, but as a laboratory, and every act of bravery, every sacrifice made by humanity and all the others, was merely a reaction they had predicted and recorded. We were not soldiers, we were lab rats. The final blast door slid open with a tortured shriek of metal. Inside, the control room was a sphere of silent, floating holograms, each one a flickering star map of a manipulated conflict. And there, at its center, stood Ambassador Vexler. He was unarmed, his hands resting calmly at his sides, his silver face a mask of serene acceptance. He did not look like a cornered animal. He looked like a professor waiting for a tardy student. "You have disrupted a process older than your star," he hummed, his voice the same placid, infuriating tone he had used in their first briefings. "But you cannot stop entropy. Chaos is the true enemy, and we are its only cure." Eva Rostova leveled her plasma rifle, her finger tense on the trigger, but the true weapon was his words. He genuinely believed it. This was not the ranting of a madman, but the calm declaration of a god who saw genocide as a necessary pruning, a cosmic gardener pulling weeds. He was not a monster who reveled in cruelty. He was an ideologue who saw their entire rebellion as a temporary, statistical anomaly, a blip of chaos in his grand, ordered universe. That made him more terrifying than any fanged beast. A monster can be killed. How do you kill a perfect, self-justifying idea? Vexler's hand moved in a single, fluid motion, pressing a sequence of glyphs on the console before him. A low, resonant hum filled the spherical chamber, and the floating holograms around them flickered and turned a violent, pulsing crimson. The serene mask of the ambassador finally cracked, not into fear, but into a terrible, cold satisfaction. "If we cannot have order, then let there be nothing." His voice was a calm, final judgment. The station's core began a deafening whine, a sound of matter coming undone. Rostova's blood ran cold. This was not a tactical retreat. It was a cosmic tantrum, the last spiteful act of a child who, told he cannot have his way, decides to smash the entire board game. The self-destruct sequence was counting down on every screen, a cascade of alien numerals racing toward zero. That explosion would not just kill them, it would tear a hole in space large enough to swallow the entire Allied fleet hovering just outside, vaporizing their last hope in a single, brilliant flash. They had not fought their way here to win. They had fought their way here to disarm a bomb. Specialist Amir slammed his own datapad into a console port, his fingers a blur. "I am in, but their security protocol is a labyrinth. It keeps rewriting itself. We cannot just stop it. We have to convince the station's core intelligence that destroying itself is an illogical act. Plasma fire echoed from the corridor as her marines held the door against a fresh wave of Cathar defenders. The station shuddered around them, metallic groans echoing through the deck plates. Rostova stared at the central console, at Vexler standing placidly before it, a monument to his own twisted philosophy. He believed chaos was the ultimate enemy. So she would give him chaos, but not the kind he expected. She bypassed the complex override routines and opened a direct channel to the fleet, to Krill, to Gorok, to every ship in that ragged armada. She fed them the station's internal schematics, the location of the core, the precise energy frequency of the containment field that was now failing. "Do not target the defenses," she shouted over the rising whine. "Target the structural integrity of the chamber around the core. Blast it open." The Cathar had planned for every logical assault, every attempt to hack their perfect system. But they had never planned for someone to simply tear the walls down. Outside, the fleet shifted its aim. Instead of a concentrated barrage on the heavily shielded core, they unleashed a storm of disparate weapons on the station's superstructure around it. Crystalline beams sliced through support girders, plasma melted through bulkheads, kinetic rounds from a Velnar dreadnought punched holes through entire decks. The station, a symbol of perfect order, was being violently, messily dismantled. Alarms screamed a new, panicked frequency. The countdown stuttered. The core intelligence, faced with a cascading systems failure it could not contain, was forced to make a choice. Continue the self-destruct sequence and guarantee its own annihilation, or divert all power to emergency containment and structural reinforcement. For a being whose prime directive was self-preservation and the acquisition of knowledge, the choice became, for the first time, illogical. The crimson holograms flickered, then died. The deafening whine of the core faded to a strained, low thrum. The countdown stopped. Vexler watched, his serene expression finally crumbling into something empty and lost. His final, perfect order had been broken not by a superior logic, but by a messy, unpredictable, and beautifully chaotic act of salvation. The silence that followed was not the silence of the void, but the profound, ringing quiet of a bullet dodged. The core was a dying star in their hands, its frantic whine clawing at the metal walls. With the station's structure failing, there was no time for a delicate shutdown. Captain Rostova gave the only order left: divert all power to the emergency thrusters, shunt the entire core assembly out of the bay and into a collision trajectory with the system's sun. It was a brutal, inelegant solution. The station shuddered violently as massive magnetic rails engaged, hurling the pulsing, unstable heart of Cathar control out into space. On the viewport, they watched the silver sphere containing the trapped and placid Vexler tumble end over end, a glittering offering to the stellar furnace. It was not a moment of triumph, but of grim, horrifying necessity. The core hit the sun's chromosphere and vanished in a silent, final flash, taking 1,000 millennia of stolen knowledge and 1 billion betrayed lives with it. The reaction was instantaneous. Across the battle zone, the remaining Cathar ships, which had been fighting with machine-like precision, suddenly broke formation. Their attacks ceased, their elegant vessels turned as one, and without a single transmission, without any final threat, they simply powered up their drives and retreated into the deep void, leaving the Allied fleet alone amidst the wreckage. The grand design was in ruins. The manipulators had been stripped of their central intelligence, their purpose extinguished, but the victory felt hollow, stained by the sheer scale of the loss. They had saved themselves by destroying a library of cosmic history, and they were now left floating in the silence, the architects of their own future with no map to guide them. The silence after the core's destruction was heavier than any battle. Across 1,000 star systems, the war simply stopped. Xylos fleets, no longer harried by Cathar-manipulated attacks, drifted to a halt. Human task forces, their orders suddenly meaningless, hung in the void, their weapons cooling. The grand artificial conflict sustained by a single malevolent intelligence had been unplugged. But peace did not bloom in its place. Captain Rostova stood on the Odyssey's bridge, watching the first fragmented reports flood in from a galaxy waking from a nightmare. She saw the scorched planets, the refugee flotillas with no home to return to, the generations of hatred sown between species who had never known their true enemy. "They are gone," she said, her voice quiet and heavy with the weight of it all. "But the fires they lit will burn for generations. We stopped the arsonist, but the forest is still ablaze." It was a somber, brutal truth. The Cathar were vanquished, but their legacy was a galaxy poisoned by suspicion and grief. The real work, the slow and painful healing, was only just beginning. How do you rebuild trust in a universe built on a lie? The air on the Odyssey's bridge was thick with the scent of ozone and alien musk, a living testament to the gathering. Captain Rostova stood before a holographic star chart flanked by krill, whose crystalline form refracted the soft light, and the hulking, moss-covered Gorok. A reptilian commander, Slick, stood nearby, his forked tongue occasionally tasting the charged atmosphere. They were no longer a desperate coalition of survivors, but the founding members of a new compact. The agreement was not written on parchment or etched in metal, but forged in the shared memory of betrayal. Krill's chiming voice was the first to formalize the vow. "We will share all that we are," he stated, "our technologies, our histories, our warnings. Your human resilience, our crystalline harmonics, the Velnar mastery of gravity. These are not weapons to be hoarded, but tools to be pooled." Gorok's low rumble echoed the sentiment. "The Cathar weaponized our differences, setting my strength against your speed, his ingenuity against her spirit. They believed our diversity was a weakness to be exploited." He clenched a massive, stony fist. "They were wrong. Our diversity is our shield, and now it will be our foundation." One by one, each representative added their assent, their unique voices blending into a single, unified purpose. They vowed that never again would they allow their cultures to be turned against one another. They would build a new galactic power, not on the shifting sands of deception, but on the unshakable bedrock of shared truth. It was not an empire they were creating. It was a promise echoing across the stars that the silence would never again be filled with lies. The new alliance did not disband in celebration. Instead, it turned its collective gaze outward, weaving a web of listening posts and deep space sensor buoys across the galactic rim. They called it the Long Watch, a silent sentinel network built from salvaged Cathar tech and a dozen different alien sciences, all dedicated to a single purpose: ensuring the silence would never again be filled with silver-skinned lies. Years later, Admiral Eva Rostova stood on the observation deck of a new flagship, her face etched with the lines of command and memory. Before her, a holographic star chart glimmered, each point of light representing a listening post, a promise kept. Her crew, a mix of human, Velnar, and Xylos officers, waited in respectful silence. She pointed a finger at the vast, empty swaths of the map, the uncharted voids where physics frayed and light died. "They are hiding again," she said, her voice calm and certain, licking their wounds in the deep dark, trying to calculate a new equation. Her hand formed a fist. "But we will be waiting, and next time we will not need to be tricked into a fight." The promise hung in the air, not as a threat of war, but as a vow of protection. Eternal vigilance was the price of their hard-won truth, a shield held steady against the infinite, waiting night. Peace is a delicate structure, more easily shattered than maintained. The galaxy, once echoing with the roar of manipulated battles, now hums with the quiet, painstaking work of reconstruction. Humanity, once a naive weapon in a cosmic lie, has been forged into a guardian of a brutal and precious truth. In her final log entry, Admiral Eva Rostova's voice is not one of victory, but of solemn reflection. "They thought they could use our fury and then disappear," she states, the words carrying the weight of billions lost. They were wrong. Our greatest weapon was never our ships. It was our capacity to learn, to unite, and to remember. That single, hard-earned insight closes a long and bloody chapter of galactic deception. It does not, however, promise a fairy tale ending. The new era it inaugurates is not one of blind optimism, but of cautious, clear-eyed hope. It is a future built not on the promises of silver-skinned saviors, but on the shared memory of a lie that nearly consumed them all. Every listening post on the rim, every joint patrol with a Xylos vessel, every shared memory of a world lost is a testament to that vow. The war is over, but the watch has just begun, a silent, eternal guardian against the darkness and against the part of themselves that might ever be tempted to believe in an easy answer.